This is the Art of Learning series, and that means that some of these first 5 minutes or so is going to be a quick, very, very quick recap of all of the themes of the series and how this particular item fits in. And I hope it'll make sense to you. I know it will make sense to you if you have been attending or if you are planning to or have attended the others or watched the videos of them. But it should make sense just all by itself. Right? So it's not there's no requirements here. The logo for our series is the universal symbol of an iceberg, which looks like this. And the reason that we talk about icebergs when we talk about learning and so forth, when we talk about the learning environment, especially writing, is that Hemingway said that the dignity of the movement of an iceberg lies in only 1/8 of it being above water. So really, your dignity as a knower, as a knowledgeable person, as a learned individual, as somebody who's educated, who's passed through higher education, isn't in your performance on the surface. It is in the competence that that performance suggests under the surface. Right? So most of it is going to be under the surface, but you will be, of course, day to day, hour to hour, able to perform that competence. And we have a name for that competence. We call it knowledge. And then I usually like to emphasize that it's not a thing, it's not an asset, it's not something you just acquire and put in the bank, then you've got it. What's happening is that you are knowledgeable, right? So you are able to know things by the time you get done with your education. You don't just have a bunch of knowledge, you've also made yourself better able to know other things, right? So you are learning, and also, as we often say, learning to learn. Right, so you're better able to know things. You're a better holder of knowledge, but you're also enabled by what you know to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So knowledgeable people we hire them into positions, we put them in positions of responsibility because of their knowledge, because they're able to do things that people who don't have that knowledge are not able to do. Right? That's really important to keep in mind, that it is a competence in that sense. So we can distinguish the competence that is under the surface from the performance of that competence that you sometimes demonstrate. And of course, we keep a running tab on whether or not you're capable of that performance at university by making you go to exams, either written or oral, right? We make sure that you are capable of the things that we want you to be before we give you a degree and sort of certify that you have this competence, right? It's pretty ordinary stuff. So what's on the surface of your competence as a scholar or as a completed student, right? A graduate of a higher education institution? Well, one of the things, and I'll be talking about this next week, is you are better writers than most people about the subject that you're studying, right? So you're better writers about finance or about marketing or about organization or about production, right? And whatever subjects you're taking, you're just better writers because of the knowledge you have. You're enabled by the knowledge that you have to write more effectively than others. And next week, I'll talk about exactly what that competence looks like. Right? You're also better, and I think you've already experienced this in yourself and in your peers in your program, you are better talkers, right? You're better able to discuss matters related to your studies. And we are also going to have a talk about that. So there will be an entire session on how to talk eloquently about your area of expertise. And then today's subject is going to be thinking. So that's another thing you're better able to do. We'll talk about what exactly that means. I sometimes like to say, and we're going to divide this up just a little bit. We'll put a little bit of a squiggly line along the bottom here. That way down underneath these competences up here, there is kind of an underlying silent competence even. Like it's not just under the surface, it's deep, deep under the surface. And I think you can imagine what the one for writing is, right? So if our ability to write has something very silent, almost invisible under the surface of it, it's the thing we talked about last week, right? You are also able to read, right? You are simply, from a writing and read, you're able to write and read more competently, so you are more literate, right, than people who don't have your education in your subject area, right? So you're literate in that subject area. So remember that somewhere down below your writing ability is a bunch of reading that you've done that has given you a sense of what writing even means in your discipline, right? And so we can immediately, I think you can imagine what the underlying competence of talking is, right? If you're a good talker, you've probably also been a reasonably good listener, right? And that means you're good at listening in a conversation, but you're also good at listening in a situation like this, right? You're good at extracting information from a more or less coherent oral presentation, right? And you can practice that today. I'll try to be more or less coherent, right? And you can practice whether or not listening is a skill you have. And this is going to feel a bit fluffy, right? But it's simply true that if you're a good thinker, you have some control over your emotions. You have some emotional discipline, right? And the way we're going to talk about this, because we have a session on reading and we're going to have a session on listening as well. And we're also going to have a session on feeling, although I thought calling it how to feel is going to sound a little bit weird. So I called it how to enjoy things, right? So how to have a good feeling about the things you're doing, right? So there is a kind of emotional competence that underlies way deep, deep, deep under the surface. There's an emotional competence that underlies that your education kind of gives you. Right? So your education isn't just stuffing knowledge into you, and it's not just making you intellectuals, right? It's making you able to enjoy this business of knowing things and thinking about things and talking about things and this kind of thing, right? So there is that kind of emotional competence, and we'll talk about that. And as a kind of recap from the first lecture and a anticipation of the very last one, the first lecture was called How to Know Things, and the last one is called How to Know Things Again. So sort of how to retain things and how to bring this competence forward into the future. The basic scheme of that is to divide this space, this competence under the surface, into, in fact, 15, but I'm just going to focus on 9 kind of subcomponents of this competence. And the writing competence is actually the ability to, in writing, support, elaborate, or defend your ideas. Right? So there's really 3 things you're able to do. If you're a good academic writer, you're able to kind of decide what you want to say and then say, how do I know that? And then you can support it, elaborate it, or defend it. And in the talk next week, we'll talk really about how do we get good at that? How do we get good at thinking about our competence in terms of support, elaboration, and defense of claims, 1 paragraph at a time. And I really want to stress that that's a really good way of thinking about this, writing about a half a page knowledgeably. That's what you want to be good at. Last week, we talked about reading, and I said, try to read about every half a page for how does the writer support, elaborate, or defend their ideas, right? So the same strategy is just turned on its head. As far as talking goes, there's also sort of 3 major components to that. This is not an exhaustive list of what it means to be a good talker, but it's pretty good indication of what that competence is like. You've all heard somewhere that there's no such thing as a stupid question, and you've all experienced in your lives that that is a lie. Of course, there are stupid questions. There are ill-informed questions, right, that come out of ignorance. So being a knowledgeable talker is somebody who can distinguish between a good and a bad question. Being a competent speaker is somebody who doesn't have to say, I think that's a stupid question, but steers the conversation away from a fruitless avenue of inquiry onto more fertile ground, right? Without the person asking the question really knowing that's what happened, right? So that's competence and we use our knowledge to do that, right? It's one of the performances we have. We can recognize good questions, we can ask good questions, and we can move the conversation away from bad ones, right? Subtly, elegantly, skillfully, craftily, if you will, right? Good talkers also have a shared sense of humor in their knowledge community, right? So you know what's funny and you know what's not funny. And you recognize that as you get an education, certain things become funny that weren't funny before you got knowledgeable enough to get the jokes. And the opposite happens. Certain jokes about Wall Street bankers or about marketers or about lawyers or about psychologists, if that's what you're studying, stop being funny because you now know it too much to get the joke, right? So your sense of humor changes, right? And you share that with the people in your program. Does that make sense? Right? So keep that in mind. That's part of your skill set, is an awareness of what's funny and what's not. Right? Not because you're telling jokes all the time, but because you know the boundary, right? And you can use it. And then there's the one that I will talk in more detail about this when we get to it in the how to talk. Yeah, there's a kind of a warning here in any community that includes a community of knowledgeable people. There are things that it's not okay to say. There's a kind of boundary to the politically correct, things you should worry about. And what I will explain to you in the how to talk, and what I already gestured at in the how to know things talk, is that I really want to encourage you to be both brave and kind in exploring the difficulty of having conversations about controversial subjects. And it's a skill that you really want to develop now, because I'm sure you've heard about all kinds of controversial cases where it's affected people's career paths to simply not be good at having difficult conversations, right? They've accidentally said the wrong thing. To put it a little provocatively, if you're going to offend somebody, do it on purpose, right? That's part of your skill, right? You shouldn't go after offending people, right? But you should be deliberate about it so that you also know, okay, I'm going to do this, and then I know how to handle that situation afterwards, right? Worst case when you're doing this is if you're good at having difficult conversations, if you're really good at it, then getting through a controversial argument, at the end of it, you may no longer be friends, but you're still peers, right? You're still colleagues in the discipline. You still respect each other as thinkers and knowers, but now you don't like that person anymore, right? That's fair, right? Because you don't like their politics or you don't like their morals or whatever, but you understand that it's within the scope of the discipline, right? Worst case, not desired outcome, right? And then there's this question of how does knowledge make us better thinkers? And philosophers are really good at helping us with that because they have a great definition of knowledge that really puts the mental component of knowledge in the foreground, and that's of course what we're going to be spending the rest of the evening or afternoon talking about. What they will say is, if you know something, you're able to make up your mind about it. So you get some data or you get a situation, so you can form a belief about it, right? You make up your mind about what you think is going on here, why it's important, why it's significant, right? So you're able to form beliefs. And that's not trivial. It's not like believing something is just something we would just normally do. Many people like me are exposed to information all the time, and I don't know what to make of it, right? So I'm left, lots of information, but no real state of belief comes out of that. And if you have the right amount of knowledge, you can go from the information to a state of belief, a made-up mind, right? And of course, thinking is going to help us do that. You all probably know the experience of making up your mind and then finding out a few days later that you're wrong, right? Sometimes that happens, normal thing. So philosophers will say, look, you can't just have any old belief if you want to be knowledgeable. You got to have true ones, right? Knowledge is not just belief. It is good belief, right? As in true belief, beliefs that are correct, right, that are right. And then there's this situation will happen. I mean, some of you may accidentally, as we go along here, form the belief that that I know what I'm talking about in the way of thinking, right? That I'm a good philosopher or something. And I did actually get a degree in philosophy, but I don't claim to be a philosopher. So you may say, oh, Thomas is a smart guy, right? Philosopher. But I'm open to the idea that not all of you will form that opinion. Right, so some of you may form the opinion that I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not much of a philosopher. And then you may go out afterwards and talk about it, compare your ideas. Is Thomas a good philosopher? Right? And one of you may say, well, I think he's a good philosopher. Now I can tell you, you formed a true belief. Good. So far, so good. But then suppose you're asked to defend that belief and you say, did you not notice he had a beard? Right? And bearded men are always good philosophers. Right? So what we know from that, just from you coming with that argument, is that you have a prejudice, right, in favor of bearded men. Right? Thank you very much, but that's not a good argument. And so what philosophers are going to say is you actually have to not just believe something, it has to not just be true, you have to have what we consider a good reason to believe it. You have to have a justified true belief. And that's really that's mainly what we're going to be talking about today, right? Is that what if thinking is the art of making up your mind, right? Then what are the things that go into that that we would acknowledge and valorize as good reasons? What does good thinking look like? Right? That's really the idea. So that's the overview, and this actually covers the entire series, right? This is what the entire series is going to be about. Today, we're right over here. Are there any questions about that first little introductory gesture? I can see I've already gone over time, so it's definitely going to take a little longer than 45 minutes. Now, one thing I normally say is that there's kind of disciplines that go with this. So you can actually read lots of books about each of these things, right? There's a whole discipline that studies literature and literacy, right? So you can either go to the scholars of poetry and literature and so forth, novels. There's, of course, linguists and everything like that. There's lots of research on this if you want to know more about reading and writing. Certainly, there's also a lot of research about this. There's not just communication studies, but there's thousands of years of tradition in rhetoric in studying that, right? And then, of course, there's philosophy, which also is as old as rhetoric, is also thousands of years old. So there's a long tradition of that. But I do want to make an acknowledgement to the competing discipline that I'm not going to talk very much about, but that I know a lot of people find quite useful in thinking about thinking, and that is psychology, right? Especially social psychology, and there's lots of empirical research that has been done into thinking, and especially the kinds of errors we habitually make in thinking, the sorts of biases we have. And of course, you probably are familiar or could easily be familiar with this book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, right? Which goes through just sort of ordinary heuristics that we use, and sometimes that mislead us into drawing conclusions, making up our minds in ways that are not correct, right? I should say, of course, that like all research, there's people who debate it, right? So there are some people who think this is correct and not correct, but there's certainly a program here for improving your thinking, for getting you to notice things that are maybe not as reasonable as we sometimes think. That's one approach. Go to psychology, right? I just want to acknowledge that, so that even though I am a philosopher and think I have my own way of doing this, right, there is that program out there as well. Some other suggestions, these are all things we have in the library, by the way. There's Graham Wallace, The Art of Thinking, The Art of Thought, right? Very thoughtful book about the subject, also goes through the kinds of things that make us good thinkers and things we should keep in mind. A pretty personal statement of that. came to my attention through the sense-making discipline. So there's organizational sense-making. Carl Weick has read this book and has acknowledged it, and has, if you want to say, stolen a couple of ideas from it, right? So there's a little bit of historical. It's I think it's from the 50s, if I'm not mistaken. No, sorry, it's from 26, somewhere thereabouts. So it's quite, it's almost 100 years old. And then there is Susan Stebbings' Philosophical Thinking to Some Purpose, and you're welcome to come up here and have a look at these books. Also a kind of working through of things that work and don't work, things that might confuse us, including political issues, ways that we get misled by our politicians and advertisers and so forth. All, as you can see, reasonably, readable in size, right? So recommended, and also written in such a way that, they're presenting themselves to people who are not specialists in the discipline. This is not true of the last book I want to show you. It's a very big, thick garçon de mop, as we say in Danish, not quite Danish. Called Making It Explicit by Robert Brandom. It's a complete analysis of what reasoning is really all about, what makes us reasonable beings. And I do kind of, and I think I'm bragging a little bit maybe, I do kind of think what I'm going to tell you today is sort of a popular summary of this. I don't understand it well enough to really do it justice, right? But to me, it really feels like he's getting it right at a fundamental level, and I'm just going to tell you some things that you can use in your day-to-day, right? So if you want to go to the heart of it, and if you have some time, here's a big, thick book that I'm throwing at you. Good. I'll be mentioning a couple of things that he mentions and an example that he suggests, which I think is a good and clear one. All right, so let's start. What we're going to do is draw another iceberg. And what we want to do is just focus on this part of it. So imagine turning it, right, a little bit to give ourselves a little more room. And we're still going to put the beliefs up here. So now we're going to, we're going to put the beliefs up here on the surface. We're going to say, what if believing was the performance, was the competence, right? Then what is under the surface? And the first thing I want to tell you is that, remember what the belief really is. It is a performance of a thought, right? So it is your mental performance of not thinking, but a thought, right? So you have a belief, and what it does is at the sort of tip of this iceberg with a maximum amount of dignity, what you're having is a thought, right? And you could say that believing, and this is, this totally in accordance with ordinary language, right? Believing something is just thinking that something is true. Right? So when we believe something, we think it is true. And what I'm wondering is what happens under the surface when we have a thought like that, right? When we think something is true. So it's not just an idea, it's not just like a hunch or something like that. What's happening is we are actually thinking that something is true. What's going on there? We have to get to the content of this belief. We have to figure out what is it in a belief that we consider true. What is the thing that is true but maybe could be false, right? And here philosophers have a great way of talking about this. They talk about propositional attitudes. Right? So you have a propositional attitude when you have a belief because you think something is true. It's not just beliefs that are propositional attitudes. Think of desires, right? Think of hoping, for example, right? So if I hope, then I hope either that something is true or I hope that something will be true in the future. Right? Again, there's something in there, there's something that I have an attitude about. It could be an attitude of belief, kind of a posture of belief, or it could be a posture of desire, hope, fear, right? Contempt. But there's lots of things, but they all have content. They're propositional in the sense that there's something in them, right? That could be taken to be true or false, or could happen or not, or whatever. There's some proposition in there. So that's the first analysis we're going to do. We're going to say under the surface of our beliefs is this ability to construct a proposition. And that proposition, sometimes philosophers will say we can entertain that proposition, which is to say we can suspend the question of whether or not it's true, right? We can approach it and we can analyze it without immediately considering whether or not it's true. So your first move in thinking is actually to say, what's something I believe, but let's imagine I don't know whether or not it's true. Now I'm starting to think, right? And you could immediately go take your thoughts in the direction of how do I actually know this? It's a different question, right? But that's not what we're going to do here. We're going to say, what if we continue thinking, not just seeking the evidence and assuring ourselves that it's true, but we're going to think about this. Philosophers say the proposition really has two different things, and sometimes actually this propositional content is talked about as conceptual content of thought. So there's some sort of conceptual content. So we'll say there's a concept. All of the things that go into everything that we talk about, everything I'm talking about today is just a bunch of concepts, really, right, that are put together. But they are put together also with objects, right? So red is a concept, right? And this pen is an object that is red in a relevant sense of red, right? Does that make sense? Right. So concepts are things we can apply to objects. And once we do that, this is the interesting thing, right? So once we put a concept and an object together, and this is Gottlob Frege, turn of the last century philosopher's big insight, right? We get a function, right? So a proposition is actually a function of a concept and an object, or a concept, in fact, is a function, right? That when it takes an object becomes true or false, right? So instead of a function that you put in a bunch of numbers and then you get a bunch of numbers out, right? You've got basically just a linguistic function that you put in an object and then it becomes true or false. So this pen, so if I say this pen is red, right? That's true. Right? But if I was to use exactly the same concept with this one and say this pen is red, that's false. And the only difference is it took a different object and the outcome, the output of that was truth or falsity. So you can look at your beliefs, you can turn them into propositions, just using ordinary language like that. And then you can decide, well, what's the active concept in this thought of mine, right? And what's the object that this concept ranges over? And so is this true or false given this object? Right? Does that make sense? Simple little analytical tool. And I'm not trying to convince you that this is a correct philosophy. I'm just trying to convince you that this would be a useful thing to do every once in a while when you're sorting through what is it actually I believe here. Because now we get into some interesting things. All of what I just did is basically just kind of logic. Right? We're just kind of thinking logically there, right? And now we're going to get into something a little more interpretive, a little more sort of hermeneutics of this, right? We're going to try to get into what do we understand by all of this. I'll do it in black. What do we understand by this, right? So we take a proposition and we try to say, what is it this proposition means, right? We try to give it some meaning. And like I say, we've analyzed it into a concept and an object. We realize that what's going on there is we get a function that different objects make it true and another set of objects make it false, right? There's lots of red things in the world. There's lots of not red things in the world, right? And that's how that function works. That's how that concept works. So if you're and this is, again, not something you have to be, but it's something that's useful to be for the sake of argument every once in a while. If you're a logical positivist or a verificationist, you'll say the meaning of the proposition is whatever there is in the world that makes it true. Right? So if you want to understand what does a proposition mean, you say, to understand this, I will try to imagine the things that make it true. And so if I say, I am Thomas Bespu, right? There's really only one thing in the world that makes that true. Now, that sentence is true, but it's very narrow, the amounts of things that are true, right? But if I say, someone is a writing consultant, then there's suddenly lots of different instances of that, right? Lots of different people that could be that, right? And many of them I don't even know. Right? So we can say, well, what are the things in the world? If I mean something, do I mean something that is made true by lots of things? Or is it something that is made true by only a few things? Right? And I can really try to get a sense of what are the things that I'm going to let make this sentence true, this proposition true. Right? That's a really important act of thinking. I don't know if you have already done some philosophy of science, but if you do some philosophy of science, you will, of course, hear about logical positivism. You'll hear that it is completely debunked, right? That it is not a good philosophy of science. And there's reasons there's ways to defend it, I would say, but there are reasons that the reasons you will be receiving are good reasons, or perfectly good criticisms. Don't want to dunk on your teachers there. I would defend positivism a little more, maybe. But one of the great arguments against logical positivism is this twist on the verificationist principle of meaning, which says a proposition means whatever it is that makes it true, right? Because Karl Popper came along and said, well, at least when we're talking about theories, it's much more useful and, in fact, much more scientific to say, no, it's whatever in the world makes it false and that we're claiming is not the case, right? Knowing what makes a sentence false is much more important from the point of view of science than knowing what makes it true. And that's what's usually called falsificationism. But just remember, you can think about the proposition from both of those sides. You can say, what's all of the things in the world that can make it true, normal verificationist theory of meaning, or you can say, what are all the things in the world that make this false? What are the sorts of things that make it false? And that's what I'm going to understand by this sentence, what it excludes, not what it includes. Right? Good little heuristic there, right, for thinking about this. And that brings us, I try to do this in a order, but I already mentioned it, but it brings us to another layer down below our understanding. We've gone from beliefs to the propositions, to the way our ability to understand those propositions, our understanding, letting ourselves make sense of it, right? Attribute meaning. And then the imagination. Now we're getting into territory that is much more pleasant, maybe, much more open, much freer, because what we're going to now say is these things are facts in the world that make our propositions true or false. What we want to do is teach ourselves to imagine them, right? To really form pictures of them. George Orwell, the famous mid-century writer, known for Orwellian dystopias, right? He, in his writing advice, said, look, we have a tendency just to put words together when we write. And we just put the right words together. Maybe concepts and objects that formally, logically fit together. And when things we've seen our teachers put together, we've read in our books, they go together and so forth. So we put these words and phrases together and it feels intelligent, right? It feels articulate, right? But he said, maybe sometimes what we should do is just wait, let the words come a little bit later and form the images first, right? Bring a picture before our mind and then really let our expression sort of find the right words to paint that picture for the reader, right? Or the person we're talking to. And so when you're practicing the art of thinking, really remember that what you're doing is you're going from these things you believe are true, things you think are true. You're isolating the propositional content. You're analyzing it into concepts and objects. You're understanding the things that make such propositions true or false in different situations, right? But you also have an ability to picture an organizational hierarchy, right? Or you have an ability to picture a downsizing operation in a company, right? Or you have an ability to imagine an interpersonal situation between an employee and an employer, right? A job interview or whatever, right? Like you have an ability to imagine these situations. And one of the places, and I'll bring this back again at the very end, and also when we talk about how to write, one of the things I'd really encourage you to remember is that when you're writing about your methods, this is one of the places where, and sorry, I shouldn't just focus on writing. I'm a writing consultant, that's why that happens. But, or just talking to your teachers or whatever. Remember that methods is really just what you did and why you did it, right? So it's actual experience. It's things you did to collect data. So one thing is to imagine a situation that you might be an expert in, like if you're doing human resource management, you might be an expert in employee development interviews, right? So you have a good idea of what happens in those interviews, in those conversations, right? So you're sitting there, and sorry, you're not sitting there, but you're imagining it for yourself. And there's an employee and a manager, and they're talking to each other. And you can imagine that situation. But if you're a good researcher, then you can also imagine interviewing those people in a semi-structured interview. You can imagine what it means to pick the people that you want to interview. You can imagine those kinds of situations. And when you read about other people's semi-structured interviews, you have a clear image in your mind about what they must have done to gather this data. Right? Just keep that in mind, that all your thinking is doing that as well. That when you're thinking, you're trying to pass from things you're going to accept are true, just statements, claims, right? But you're trying to think it through in such a way that you get to a level where you have a nice image of what's going on. You can picture it before your mind's eye, as it were. We're not done yet. Because we're going to get transcendental. I was kind of happy when I noticed this, right? If we, so I always get insights when I'm developing these talks, right? And it's like, oh, this is interesting, right? So this is, let's say this is just sort of a logical approach to thinking, right? And then we have this sort of more hermeneutic, which just means the art of interpretation. So this idea of, trying to attribute meaning and understanding, right? This would be this layer here. But then we're going to get to the transcendental level, right? What is it that comes beyond, what kind of raises us above this whole, even though we're going down lower, which is fine. If any of you read Kant, right? This is the sense in which I mean transcendental. And you'll see that again, and I encourage you to, if you do want to pursue philosophy, this is where you would go now. You would go to Kant, because Kant would say that imagination is enormously important to knowing something. Right? My suggestion to you is to say, you shouldn't believe something that you don't understand. Right? That's a pretty good norm. Don't let somebody make you believe something if you don't understand what they're saying. And you shouldn't think you understand something if you can't imagine it. Right? Sometimes we don't make that move, right? So let imagination be sort of the minimal condition for ever believing something. Can I even imagine it, right? Do I understand it? Okay, should I believe it? And that really is the question is, okay, I can imagine it, I understand it, is it true? Right? But before we get to that, the capacity even to imagine something, to bring concepts and objects together in imagination, right? There has to be something that kind of makes that possible immediately. And this is what Kant says. He says, by whatever means we know things, we know them immediately in intuition. right? So there's some things that we actually have to really think hard about and explore for and work at knowing before we can form a belief about it. But when you walked into this room, you knew you were in a classroom, right? You knew there were other people here. You are making immediate sense of lots of things that I'm saying, right? That's happening without you even thinking, right? That doesn't take any. It's just that just makes immediate sense, right? And that's called intuition. It's not it's not intuition in the sense of I have an intuition, I have a hunch, right? It is this immediate presence in your mind um, before you form an opinion that these things are true. Right? Objects are given to you intuitively in advance of thinking. Right? Now, for Kant, he was very, very sort of insistent in, as a philosopher, trying to figure out the things that must necessarily be true in advance of any other thinking that we do. So he really wanted to kind of develop a science of intuition so that he could tell us exactly how intuition works and what all the things are that are immediately available to us from the beginning. And the problem with that is that he ended up getting some very abstract categories out of that. So some very abstract things like time and space and stuff. Right? These are the things that we can all agree exist prior to anything we might know. And that's nice, but it's not very interesting. And more recently, much more recently, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher and historian of science, came up with this idea of a historical a priori. So it's still a priori, it still comes before thinking, but it has a history behind it. So it shapes, there's a history that shapes the things that we take to be immediately true. And the reason I bring this up is that when you're looking through your iceberg, right, when you're thinking through this iceberg, you're going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, you will reach a point where you say, I can't even imagine it being different, right? I've now reached the point, the limits of my imagination. It must certainly be this way. And that's where you can actually use thought, turn it on itself and get even deeper and say, wait a minute, is this just because of the way I was raised? Is this just because of the culture in which I live, right? Is this because, is this my history that is just making me think it couldn't possibly be any other way? So Wittgenstein has a great example of this, and it's kind of funny to read now because he was writing this in the early 1950s, so not that long ago, actually, right? And he said, if anybody ever said, I've been to the moon, right? We surely know that that is false, right? That must definitely be false. That can't possibly have happened. Of course, just like 10, 15 years later, it became just something that we can definitely imagine, right? We know how to get there. We know how to get back. Right? So somebody could say, I've been to the moon. So that's just history changing our sense of the imaginable, right? Of course, you could argue, you can imagine going to the moon because there were science fiction authors even back then, right? So they had already imagined this. But our intuitions change. Our ideas about what must certainly be true, what must exist, what categories best divide up the world change. And we're actually living in a time, I'm not going to get into the different controversies about it, but we're living in a time where certain lines are being redrawn, right? There's lots of different categories that there's a great deal of historical fervor, great deal of politicking about. It's trying to change people's intuitions about how to see each other, right? How to see things in the world, how to approach the reality that we face. And we can do that deliberately. That's the point, right? So the point is that even when we get to the limits of our imagination, we can say, let me reflect on that. Let's try to make that more, be more deliberate about my intuitions, reform my intuitions deliberately. There's a word of caution here. And I say this as a professionally trained philosopher, somebody who claims to know what he's doing. You can really get stuck in that. Like once you have realized the contingency of your intuitions, right, that there's some history behind it, and even my intuitions could be otherwise. So even the things I thought were immediately true could be otherwise. You can really just start thinking, well, maybe I'm just wrong about all of that. And then you just stay at that level. You stay down here, right? And so the art of thinking is not to get down to the transcendental depths, right? The art of thinking is to get down and then get back up, so you can still form beliefs, right? You want to remain, just because you're a philosopher doesn't mean you're not a functional human being. You have to be able to do this, right? And philosophers are, of course, people who take their time with it, so they don't have any problem being kind of strange for a while. Right? But that's not the job of thinking. The job of thinking ultimately is not to be contingent, open to things and so forth. The job of thinking is to get back to the point where you can make up your mind again, right? And that's why you really need a sense of the depth of the problem, right? And even have that sense as you proceed down. So, have a belief, maybe that's good enough. Actually, maybe you have an assignment due in a week and the beliefs you have are good enough. You don't need to do a lot of reflecting. What you need to do is get those things written down, you get the assignment handed in. But if you have a little more time, analyze out the proposition, right? Identify the concepts you're working with. Itemize the objects that make it true or false, right? Put the concepts together in different constellations that are meaningful to you, that have truth makers or false makers, right? Falsifications in the reality, right? But only do this insofar as you have time to go down and get back up. That's the art. You don't want to get yourself just into the darkness. You want to get yourself into the darkness and back out. Right? Yes, because, and this was one of the things that I had, let me do this one first. Because this is a Robert Brandom example. What he said, we've done this thing with the red pen, right? And what he said was, the concept of red is not just a label you put on things, right? It's an actual description, right? And it lets us infer things. It's not just major, it doesn't just refer to red things. It's not like red means everything, all the red things in the world, right? Red lets us make inferences. It lets us relate propositions to each other. So being red, the way he puts it is, being red follows from being scarlet. Right? So if something is scarlet, it is red, right? Entails being colored and rules out being green. So if you really understand the concept of red, you're not just in a position to make a list of red things, right? You're in a position to understand how that rules out saying, if I've said it's red, I can't say it's green as well, right? Unless I say it's got two colors. So there's that kind of Venn diagram sort of feeling about it. Right? So just keep that in mind, that it's not just the reference of the thing you're trying to think out. It's not just the reference of the concept to the object. You're also trying to think out the inferences that you can make once you've said that something is red about lots of other things. Right? The relationship between those things. And because of that, and this is where we get to the next kind of, so I said Wittgenstein, I said Frege, and then there's Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine, who is sort of before Brandom. Brandom is even more current than that. But Quine says, and very, very correctly, I think, that we also have to keep in mind that these beliefs that we hold, right? We don't just hold them one at a time, individually, separately. It's not like we just think this is true and this is true and this is true. And if we change our mind about one thing, then we only change our mind about that thing. What happens is all of our beliefs go together in what he calls a web of belief. And that means that when we change our minds, we have to think about what are the implications of that, right? What are the consequences of changing your mind on one thing? If you're reasonable, if you're a thinker, if you're rational, then you're going to say, well, I held this belief in a web of beliefs that were implicated in all these other inferences. And now I have to go looking for the other propositions. I have to deduce the other propositions that I may also have to consider whether or not they're true. Right? And I can look at those independently, of course, and see whether or not they are. But don't imagine that you're just holding these beliefs one at a time. As a thinker, you're holding them in a web of belief, right? And then last year, when I was doing this talk, I arrived at a very interesting kind of profundity that I think it came out in questions. But that if you think about it, because thinking is this deliberate, structured, rational way of changing your mind, because it lets us do that, it lets us change our mind in an orderly fashion, right? So we're not just changing our mind and getting confused, we're sort of orderly moving our beliefs around, shifting our ground. Thinking can actually be defined as an openness to being wrong, right? And that's really, remember, that's what happened, right? When we moved from belief to just under the surface to the proposition, we were taking the belief and then we were suspending the question of whether or not it's true, which is to say we're opening ourselves to the idea that we could be wrong. So the real value of thinking and being good at thinking is that it also makes us confident in meeting criticism, because I don't just believe this, I'm able to think about it, which means if you have reasons to believe otherwise, I can deal with those. That's part of my competence, right? So I'm open to being wrong, even though I still believe. And so I believe the things I believe. I may even believe them very confidently, but I have a structured, rational kind of posture that lets me engage with criticism. Yeah, well, I think that's a good place to end. I felt that would be a good place to end it as well, as on that kind of openness to being wrong. Keep in mind that that's what thinking's all about.